play with blocks, but I guess you're welcome to. And that. If you turn in your Bibles to the book of Nehemiah, we are going through those 52 stories this year that are key, that are foundational for our faith and our practice. We're up to the very last of the Old Testament history stories here in Nehemiah. It is about him rebuilding the walls. That's how we associate it. You know, there are some stories in the Bible that just seem so complex that they make a Shakespearean play seem simple in comparison. Yet everyone always tells me that Shakespeare wrote the very best of plays, and so even though they're complicated, I have to figure out how to understand them. But when you're unfamiliar with the characters and you're unfamiliar with the setting and the words that are used of those stories or in that old English translation of them, sometimes it's just difficult to understand those plays. I mean, what should be entertainment and exciting becomes this tedious history lesson and a boring literature class. And who really cares about the Montagues and Capulets anyways? I mean, they're just made-up people. In a similar way, we can get bogged down when trying to read through some of the stories we encounter in the Bible, especially those in the Old Testament, which is why a lot of people are perfectly okay with just sort of getting the gist of the story. When I was having to look at Shakespeare and kind of understand those, I found this little tiny book that was just called The Gist of Shakespeare. It was great. It was pre-Cliff Notes. And I could just get the gist of it. And that really helped me out. And there's some people, when it comes to the Bible, I mean, the gist would be enough. I mean, all they really want is just a short summary followed by a clear propositional point about the central idea, and that would be enough. Now, if that describes you and your experience in reading the Bible, then it would be enough for me to tell you that God had opened the door for his people living in exile to return to Jerusalem, and that Nehemiah, one of those exiles who had become a high-ranking official in Persia, would lead the third and final wave of exiles back to Jerusalem because he'd been given a commission by the king of Persia to do so, to go back and to rebuild the walls of the city that the Babylonians had destroyed, which Nehemiah did in record time. He got the walls rebuilt in 52 days. Which makes me really wish that he was in charge of our road construction around here. I mean, just imagine any construction project getting done in 52 days. I mean, that was quite an engineering feat. We'd probably even call it a miracle. Now, if you didn't know, Nehemiah was not a prophet. He was not a priest. He was not a king. He was not really anyone special in those sorts of ways at all, but he was a man of faith in God. And that's why the story of Nehemiah leading the effort to rebuild Jerusalem's walls has been used to remind generations of believers that God might use them, even though they're really nothing special, in the same sort of way. It's a story that says, oh, God could use me. Now, that's the gist of the Bible story today. So let's pray and go home. But before we do, let's just see if there's anything else in this story, something that's in the details that gets skipped over whenever you just go with the gist of things. And I want to begin with the historical timeline, which sounds tedious, because it really sets the scene of Nehemiah's story. First of all, you need to understand that God is in control of history, and he uses the ancient superpower of Assyria to be his servant in conquering the northern kingdom of Israel in 722. Isaiah even is spoken of to prophesy about it, and he uses the word "my servant" to refer to this Assyrian nation that comes in. It's estimated that once they destroy the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes in the north, as we've been talking about, they only take back an estimated 25% of those that were living in the northern kingdom. You might wonder what happened to the rest of them. Most of them were killed. The others escaped, would go to surrounding kingdoms, meaning down to the south. they would little by little filter back into their country and try to make a living of escaping the push for captivity. But not many made it. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah was spared because at that time they were being led by one of their good kings, King Hezekiah, and he led them to repent of their sins and to honor God in their lives. But even so, God sent even to them the same prophet Isaiah and also another one called Micah to warn them that if they drifted back into those old ways in which they were living for themselves and they were serving other gods, then they would not be spared the next time. But the children of God didn't listen to those prophets because they just couldn't bring themselves to really believe that God would ever allow the city that had the temple that was built to worship him ever be destroyed. They were pretty sure of themselves. They were absolutely certain that God would always step in and save the day, even if it was at the last second. So they really didn't worry too much about their behavior. They didn't really worry about how they lived. They just said, well, God's going to take care of it. We're safe. Now, meanwhile, back over in the Fertile Crescent, Assyria was conquered by Babylonia in 612. Then Babylonian's king, which was Nebuchadnezzar, appointed one of the exiled Israelites, a priest named Zedekiah, to go back to Jerusalem and become sort of his governor over it. He'd get to use the title king. That was in 597. Governors were appointed for one thing only: to collect tribute that brought wealth to the land of Babylonia from those that it had conquered. And governors got paid by exacting more than what Babylonia wanted. Whatever they could get above it was theirs. King Zedekiah went back with that purpose to Judea as directed, but he quickly decided not to do so. He decided to join forces with Egypt and to defy Babylon, which prompted Babylon to reprise by sending their armies and sieging Jerusalem and completely destroying it. Walls, city, temple. This time, only about 20% of those living in this southern kingdom of Judea were taken back to Babylon as slaves. They took the upper class, the ones who had skills that might be useful in a superpower empire, guys like Daniel. And we'll get to his story later on in a couple of weeks. They left the farmers and the laborers and the shepherds to work the fields and to work the land, because they wanted that produce to enrich their lives. They wanted to profit from someone else's labors. But in 539, back in the Fertile Crescent, Babylon was conquered by the Persians. And under the Persian control, the people who had been held captive in what was once Assyria, what became Babylon, and what is now Persia, those captives are sort of reunited. They were no longer divided by tribal lines. They were no longer considered themselves from the south or from the north. They just thought of themselves as Israel again, sort of reunited. They were granted freedom to go back to their homeland if they desired. Most of the exiles decided to stay in Persia. They didn't want to go back to a broken land with a broken people who were being used like slaves. But a priest named Ezra led back a group to specifically rebuild the temple back in 537, and also to help the people who were living there to sort of turn back to God and learn to live in his ways all over again, because most of them had forgotten. The city of Jerusalem in general remained in ruins. The gates were not rebuilt, they had been burned down, the walls were not put back up, and even the houses within the city remained destroyed. Ezra was working with his people, and they were rebuilding the temple. Now, over that time, all the governors, except for Zedekiah, who had rebelled, working for Babylon in Judea, they lived pretty opulent lives there. They lived opulent lives at everyone else's expense because they were sort of a slave laborer. they had come to treat the Judeans who had survived there with contempt. The Judeans, man, they really might as well have been enslaved people again. They were given very few rights, and they were afforded almost no justice. If they had any complaints about anything from those who were just using them to enrich their lives, they really didn't care. Just get back to work. Now, Nehemiah, who was from a Judean family that stayed in Persia, decided not to return, had worked himself up into this high position, this cupbearer position. It was not just the servant of the king, but it was a place of stature. It was a place of prestige. It was someone who was in the court and overheard everything that was going on and had some position and play in it. It's not the sort of job that you would give up in order to go back and rough it out. That's part of the reason why he stayed. And while he was in the capital city, in Susa, we're told, there were some Judeans who arrived back from the homeland, and he asked how the rebuilding was going on. And their answer is recorded in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3. This is what they told Nehemiah. The remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. You may not know, but there had been a prophecy circling among the captives who lived in exile that God was going to lead his people back, and there was going to be a rebuilding of the temple. And it was even recorded that this was going to happen within a 70-year time frame, and they were getting close to the end of those 70 years. And Nehemiah was really hoping that it was true. He was hoping to have heard some good news that this Ezra guy was really rebuilding. It wasn't just the temple, but it was walls and everything else, and God's promises are being kept, and everything is being great, and life is going to be going forward. And when he heard this news, he sighed. He realized there's not enough time to get it done. I mean, what do you do when you hear unexpected bad news? Nehemiah didn't take this news well, but he did learn the lesson of captivity. He realized that things weren't going well. It wasn't someone else's problem. It was probably my own. And so I want you to hear the beginning of Nehemiah chapter 1, starting in verse 4, what he decided to do when he thought things were hopeless. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I beseech you, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you have commanded your servant Moses. Now, the rest of that confessional prayer we read earlier in our service when we were first coming together. And after his prayer comes the story that we want to get to, the story of how God answered this very humble prayer of confession. And so I want you to pick up with me again, reading together Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. I want us to hear this in a new way. It's probably something you probably may have never read. Now, the very end of the last verse was, I was the cupbearer. And it came about in the month of Nisan, which was in the spring, first of their year, In the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, so the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid, and I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it please the king and your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. And I said to the king, "If it please the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Aspa, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go." And the king granted them to me, because the good hand of my God was on me. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent me with officers of the army and horsemen. When Sanballat and the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite officials heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. Those two that we just mentioned at the end of that text would oppose Nehemiah's efforts. You have to understand why they opposed him. They didn't want to lose their labor force. They didn't want to see Israel restored, because that meant that someone else would be in power and they would no longer be benefiting from it. Now, the rest of chapter 2 describes how Nehemiah took 3 days to assess the damage of the walls. We are not going to read that together, but it's well worth looking at. He took his time. He even went secretly. He hid from those who might misjudge what he was doing. And he found out just exactly how bad things really were, the extent of the damage. And he didn't just satisfy himself with, "Oh, all of them are." He checked every gate and every door. He looked at everything that was amiss, and he took inventory of what needed to be done. Discovering, you might say, the good that didn't need to be fixed. There were sections. He looked at things that were especially bad. Though the gates and the doors and all the things that would have to be done around them. It was a daunting civil job. He noticed all the things that would have been difficult, how many laborers you would need, all the stuff that he'd heard only rumors about. We aren't told when he spoke to the various families that were in the area still, or those who came back with him from the exile, but it must have taken place. It was obvious that he couldn't have done it in 52 days all by himself. But he gets this plan, and he pulls together the resources, and they begin to design what's going to be done. In fact, you go through and you can see all of these lists of families as you read through the book of Nehemiah. It's one of those chapters where you're going like, this is boring. What's next? It's just this name of this family that I don't know, and they worked on this gate, I don't know where it's at, and they used this wood to build this thing, and they hung it from, and it's just really tedious. And it's just one after another, after another, after another, after another. It's just like a whole chapter of that stuff. And then at the very end of it, it gives a total of how many people ended up helping. Thousands and thousands of people were involved in rebuilding, because they have this shared vision together, and they have this damage, and they're not all trying to do everything, but each of them have this little place where they're going to go. They're going to help with this small little bit of damage where they're working at, And together, they are able to do this amazing event. And while they're doing it, chapter 4 of this book records and recounts how their work is criticized. You know, if you don't want someone to be successful, you criticize them. You tell them what a lousy job they're doing and how this isn't going to make a difference and it's a waste of time. And that didn't seem to work. And so they began to even take other measures and to begin to say that we're going to attack and we're going to do that. It was to the point that Nehemiah had to go around to everyone and says, not only are you going to have to rebuild the walls, but you're going to have to protect yourselves while you're doing it. You're going to have to take up weapons. You're going to have to carry a weapon in one hand, and you're going to have to carry your tool in the other, and you're going to have to be in guard at all times and in everywhere, because these guys really don't want the walls to be rebuilt. They don't want the nation to be whole again. They don't want to be God to be in charge again, because God's ways are different. These people who are taking advantage of everyone else and essentially enacting usury on the nation, that's going to go away. And they don't want that to go away. So they put together this plan and they continue to work on it. And as they're doing it, Nehemiah has to take on other challenges, not just the building of it, not just the recruitment of all the resources of it, not just having a plan that is being put into motion, but he has to address the injustice that's being done. All of this work that's being carried off to someone else. There are these families who are helping, and they're trying to go with him, and at the same time they're sharing their stories, and they're talking about how they've been so heavily taxed that's going to be moved off to go to Babylon and pay for everyone else, that they've had to mortgage their own lands. And not only do they have to mortgage their lands to pay the taxes, that they've had to sell everything they have, and they don't have anything left. And they're afraid that it's just going to go back to being the same old way. And so Nehemiah has to assure them that things are going to be different when God's in charge. When you're following him and you're going with him, it's not going to be what you're experiencing now. It's not going to be the old way. It really is going to be new. He also has to recognize that this opposition was laying traps for him. They're saying, oh, Nehemiah, you're doing such a great job, but we all need to get together and have a council. Why don't you come over to our place, and we're going to hold this great council, and we're going to get together, and we're going to figure this whole thing out. And Nehemiah knows, if I go down there, they're going to attack me and kill me. And so he's going to I'm just going to stick to the plan I have. My charge is to rebuild the walls, and I'm going to stay with it. And he does, and he avoids their treachery. By the end of chapter 7, the walls are rebuilt in record time. Jerusalem is ready to be the new capital of a new land of people who are eager to figure out what God's way is all again. Now, just for historical context, the walls were rebuilt in 445 BC. Just for historical, that's when Socrates, the great Greek philosopher that sometimes we refer to, he was only 25 years old. He was just getting started when Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem. But Nehemiah would never have gotten to where he was without the deep sigh. We're told that when he hears that news of how bad things are, he just takes a deep sigh. A heavy breath. We know what that means. They're upset about something. They're in need of comfort over something. You probably don't know, but Nehemiah, his name is a compound word. Nehemiah is heavy breath. It was their word for to sigh. And Aya is just a little bit of Yahweh's name, of God's name, of Yahweh's name. And so heavy breath in Yahweh is what Nehemiah means. It's usually translated God comforts, from the idea that when God hears that heavy sigh, that he comes with comfort and care. And I want you to think about, when was the last time you really heavily sighed over something? When were you grieved of heart that you couldn't hide? I hope it's whenever you hear about the ruinous state of the world. When we look at the world around us and we see how many people are lost, how many people who are still enslaved by sin, I hope it leads you to have a heavy sigh. And that it may lead you like Nehemiah was and say, why is this still going on? Why are there so many lost people? It's easy to point to the world and say, oh, it's their fault. But maybe, like Nehemiah, we have to look at ourselves and say, God, I'm the one who's got sin. And maybe the reason there's no one out there working and no one working on these walls that need to be rebuilt is because we've sinned against you, God. And we need to be restored by your grace and your mercy so that we can get to the point that we can take the resources that you give to us to rebuild. I think that's part of what Jesus wants us to do. He invites us to build his kingdom, one lost person at a time. And that's what we're leaning into as a church. Jesus' great commission to do that. We don't have a king who's telling us to rebuild a wall, but we do have a God who says, I want you to think about those lost people in your lives. And I want you to go to them. And I want you to lead them to me so that they turn to me. I want them to be united to me in baptism, and I want them to learn to obey my words. And God's great plan to do that is not for some super evangelist. It's for each of you. It's for all of us to say, who's that lost person in my life that I need to be working on so that together we can rejoice in this grace harvest together. I'm going to ask the worship team to go ahead and come back forward to lead us in a final song. And as they do, I want you to start thinking, who are some of those broken down gates, those lost people, those broken down walls, those people that we know in ruinous estate that are uniquely in your life? Who are they? It's going to be a different list for each one of us. And then as you think about them being lost, I want to ask yourself, do you really care? Do you have a heart like Nehemiah? Does it make you sigh? And if it does, are you willing to turn to God and say, okay, God, here's me. You can use me. I'll go. Would you please stand as we sing together?